The war I remember, the first in the world, when the gods with spears had smitten Galvig, and in the hall of Hor had burned her, 3 times burned, and 3 times born. Thanks again to the God of War team for sponsoring this episode and making this brief overview of the Norse worlds possible. Supporters of our Extra History Patreon recently helped us fund a short experimental run for an extra mythology series. We've got 4 episodes on Greek mythology coming out later this year, but the God of War folks heard about it and offered to sponsor 2 additional episodes early. So today we bring you the Aesir-Vanir War, sponsored by the God of War team, courtesy of Norse mythology. 2 races of gods there are, 2 races of gods there will always be. For most of time, they've lived in harmony, but once this was not the case. Once there was a war like no other war, for it was a war between the gods. It was the first war, the conflict that invented war, and there will be no other like it until Ragnarok comes. This was a war over magic, because the weave of fate is not as fixed as you might think. You see, the gods as we know them, the Aesir, Odin, and all of his kin, were going about their business when they spotted a lone figure walking up the road to Asgard. It was a sorceress who offered her services to the divine host. At first, they marveled at her wisdom and her skill, for as the Norns weave fate, so can others unweave it. And this sorceress, with spindle and distaff, would respin the fates of those who requested it. This was a great temptation for the gods, for the one thing the Aesir could not overcome was fate. And while the sorceress could not make extreme changes, for none can truly do much to warp the weave that the Norns create, even her subtle alterations to fate were something worth coveting. Soon, the Aesir put her talent to petty uses, and began to bicker amongst themselves. As the tension between the Aesir grew, they began to think that perhaps the sorceress was trying to set them against one another. So they caught her and bound her, and brought her to a great hall. Thrice they tied her to a pyre, and thrice she burned. Thrice she burned, and thrice she was born again. They realized that they could not kill her, so she was released. But she was no mere sorceress. She was Freya of the Vanir, and this attempted execution could not be easily forgiven. The Aesir and Vanir each succumbed to fear, and from fear there came hate. Soon, war was inevitable. The wall that protected Asgard was overthrown, and the hosts lined up on that immortal realm's fields. With a bellow, Odin flung his mighty spear, and the battle was joined. The Aesir fought with martial valor and weapons of war, mighty and well-crafted. The Vanir fought with cryptic arts and the old lore of magic. Each side did the other great hurt. Each side fought with savagery and skill, but the 2 sides were evenly matched. Neither set of gods was greater than the other. So, after much time and much devastation, a weariness of war took them. The wise, on both sides, saw that there could be no winner to this match, and so they proposed a truce. As was the custom, the sides met and offered to exchange hostages to ensure that the truce would last. The Vanir offered up Freya and her brother Freyr, as well as a sea god named Njord, and the Aesir, in turn, offered up Honir and Mimir as hostages. The Vanir hostages were welcomed by the Aesir, and soon became permanent members of the pantheon that lived in Asgard. The Aesir hostages, too, were welcomed by the Vanir, who found themselves to be much enriched because Honir seemed wise beyond reckoning. Any problem they had, they would bring to him, and he would solve it for them. Soon, he was elevated to being one of the highest counselors among the Vanir. But the Vanir began to notice something odd. When Mimir wasn't with Honir, Honir would simply answer, "Let someone else decide," to any question asked of him. They realized they had been tricked. Honir was not a worthy hostage, but rather a simpleton the Aesir were trying to pawn off on them, and they had sent Mimir to help perpetuate the ruse. So they caught Mimir, cut off his head, and as a sign of their displeasure, sent it back to the faithless Asgardians. Odin was distraught. A lover of wisdom, he could not lose the sage advice of Mimir, so he embalmed the head and used his most powerful magic to imbue it with the power of speech. Whenever Asgard was faced with a problem too great for even Odin's wisdom, Odin would lift up the head and ask its advice. So once again, the Aesir and the Vanir came together to try to work out a pact of peace. Rather than exchange hostages, this time they all took a ritual pledge. Each chewed a berry and then spat its juice into a bowl. This juice was then fermented and became the being known as Kvasir, wisest of all that ever were. Kvasir would give out his wisdom to all freely, solving problems and resolving disputes wherever he went. But one day on his travels, he ran into two dwarves who asked for his assistance. When they had lured him into private by asking for his counsel, they slew him and strung him up and drained his body of its blood. When the Aesir searched for Kvasir, the dwarves told them that he had choked on his own wisdom and died. With his death, the last remnant of the Aesir-Vanir war passed from this world. But there is one last legacy it's left us. For those dwarves mixed honey with Kvasir's blood, and made from it a mead which they did not drink, but rather hoarded away. After changing hands many times, Odin at last came by it and drank full from it, and in doing so, introduced poetry into the world. And thus the first war ended. Thanks again to the God of War team for sponsoring this video. If you want to learn more about God of War before it drops on April 20th, check out the link in the description where you can read the lost pages and check out trailers, gameplay, and more.